Okay, guten Morgen, wie geht's Berlin? Too much party last night, right? Probably. I would have loved to be there as well, but yeah, I had to be here and give this talk to you, so I wanted to prepare very well. First of all, we have something to celebrate today. Because today is the day we are getting rid of Internet Explorer 11. And for this talk, I was thinking like, okay, web components are not supported by IE. Should I talk about polyfills or not? And then I saw this again, and I was like, it saves me a lot of time. The internet is great. So you can see this for the last time and say bye-bye. So hi, I'm Rowdy. I'm a front-end focused senior DevOps engineer with special attention for accessibility. I try to add a word every week. Why not? And I've been a Formula One geek since 1994, when the father of our current world champion got roasted a little bit in Germany. But actually, the love for Formula One brought me to the web, because in 1996 I got access to the web through a modem, but yeah, well, it's something. And I figured out what do I want to do. So I started creating my own software. I also did some Borland Delphi back in the day, and I created Formula One Explorer. And back in the day, it was very hip to call it Formula One Explorer 2000, because 2000 was coming. You might see as well that it was optimized for Internet Explorer 4. That's what we did back in the day, and also say, well, 800 by 600. Fortunately, those days are over. The fun part of this is I got in an Indonesian autosport newspaper with my software. I was like, what? And back in the day, we had magazines that had CD-ROMs with it, and the program was also on there. But, well, I still enjoy it very much, but I don't create any software more about it. So, it was mentioned already. We have a lot of JavaScript frameworks like Angular, Vue, Svelte, and React. And let me, by a show of hands, see how many people are working with these kinds of frameworks. Yeah, quite a few. So, as mentioned, you probably know what a component is, but just to be sure, a component should be a reusable, isolated part of UI with one specific responsibility. One, not more. Web components are components as well, but without using the frameworks. And web components are consistent of three parts. First of all, custom elements, templates, and the shadow DOM. And it's no coincidence I'm wearing this t-shirt, of course, because this is the Shadow Formula One team in the 70s. Dressed to the occasion, right? So, web components are not a completely new thing. Already in 2011, at my beloved Frontiers conference in Amsterdam, Alex Russell was already talking about it. Let's see what we're going to do this morning. I show a lot of code. Don't worry, you can review it later on GitHub, and the slides will be available as well, of course. So we're going to look at custom elements, templates, and shadow DOM. We're going to look at properties and attributes, lifecycle events, default slots and name slots, how to dispatch events from your component, and how to integrate them with the beloved JavaScript frameworks. So, first of all, a custom element. With a custom element, you define your own HTML element, and you can give it some behavior. Or, another way is you take a native element, and you change it a little bit, and maybe give it a little bit of different behavior as well. The first one, when you define your own HTML element, it's called an autonomous custom event, a custom element, sorry. So, how does that work? You can see some HTML here, and I already included a link to a script. So if I'm going to view this in live preview, you can see this is the paragraph that's already in the HTML. But now I'm going to add a custom element. So we are using the class syntax there, and we are extending the HTML element. That is the base element that we are using. Because we are extending it in the constructor, we also need to call the super. Yeah, and I'm not typing, by the way. And then we can set the inner HTML of our element, for instance, to this quote from our Dutch guy, Max. Now we have to make sure HTML can use it. So we will define this custom element, give it a name, and attach the class to it. But still nothing happens, of course. We go to the HTML, and below this paragraph, we're going to include it. And now the magic happens. 3, 2, 1. Whoa, there it is. It's that simple. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's simple to do. So just a little recap to get you on the baseline. We have an ES6 class definition, which works in modern browsers. Bye-bye IE. We extend it, so we have to call the super in the constructor. In this case, we set the inner HTML, and we make sure that we register the component so it's available in the DOM. And in the HTML, we insert the tag. Note that a dash is required, because otherwise you might collide with existing HTML elements or future HTML elements. So maybe use a prefix of your company or whatever. And of course, you need to include the JavaScript that you're referring to. Another way is to customize a native element. So in this case, I have a list of links to Formula One websites, but I want to make sure that if a user clicks on that link, they get a message saying, well, you're leaving our website. Are you really sure you want to do that? So if I take this in a live preview, it doesn't work, unfortunately, in VS Code. So I'm opening in a new browser. Sometimes you can use directly in the browser. In this case, you can't. So here we have the link to the website of Red Bull after the Monaco Grand Prix, but it opens in the same browser window, and I don't want that. So I have some code here saying, well, we're going to extend now the anchor element, so not the base element, but a specific element. And we add an event listener when it's clicked. And when it's clicked, we are going to show a confirm dialog whether people want to move away from the website or not. And because we're extending HTML anchor element, we need to make sure that we also set the options which one we are going to extend. So we are setting extends to A, the link. And now, very easy in the HTML, we can say on this link, we add an is attribute, and we're saying this is an external link. And now it will use my component. So if you click on this now, you can see you get a dialog saying, well, do you really want to leave our website? So there's two ways of doing things. Also a little recap of this. So you extend a specific HTML element, and you registered the extend to the DOM as well. And here in the HTML, you add the is attribute with the tag name of your own element. However, this is not supported in WebKit browsers. So Safari and all the exotic ones that are based on WebKit aren't allowing you to do this. Just ignore it. But unfortunately, there's a polyfill for that if you really want to do that. All right, let's talk about templates. Templates are very common in Vue, Angular, or whatever as well. So I don't really have a lot to say about it, except that we create a template outside of our class, and then we append it to our component this way. That's it. Styling is always hard if you're working with components. Let's see what happens if we're going to style, for instance, all the paragraphs in our indexed HTML. So we're adding here styling for the p tag, and let's say make the color green. Oops, now also the one from our custom element is green. And we want to have that, for instance, blue. So no worries, we just add some style here as well. Let's say color blue. But now everything is blue. Shit. Let's go back to the index HTML. Maybe we can do something with important there, that it's only using the one from the HTML. No, it overrides the component as well. That's tricky. I've been in this situation with Vue many, many, many times. But hallelujah, we have Shadow DOM in web components. And Shadow DOM does a lot of things, but it also, most importantly for me, it encapsulates the CSS. So nothing will leak in or leak out. And that's what we want, right? So let's see how that works. We have the same code, and we go to our JavaScript file again. But instead of doing appending this child, we first attach a shadow. And you have to specify a mode. And we're using open. You can also use enclosed, but that's trying to limit access from the outside, but it really doesn't have a real purpose. And then instead of this append child, we say this shadow root.append child. And now, magically, you can see the color is blue. Because these styles are only applied to our custom element, and it's separated from the outside. You can see that this in the inspector. This is the old situation. You can see we say F1 quote style color is blue, but here in the later situation, there we go. We have the shadow root, so it's its own little DOM that nobody can touch. And that's really nice about the shadow DOM, I would say. It's all fine. You know, we had some styling in the component itself, but yeah, not everybody wants to have a blue paragraph. You want to be able to style that from the outside. So one thing we can do is use CSS variables. And I'm changing this green to a variable called, for instance, primary color. And then I define it on the root pseudo-element, saying, well, the primary color is green. And now you can see it's green again, the first one. We can do the same thing, just be lazy and copy and paste this in our component. So replacing this, paste it, and there we have it. Well, it's green, let's change it to blue. Damn, no. You have to use host in this case. Root is not usable inside a web component. You have to use host. So keep that in mind. But what if you want to have people have a say about the colors, right? We now have the variables there, but let's see if they can change it from the outside. I added 2 new ones. Now I also added the IndyCar quote, just to see a difference in ways we can do it. So I'm importing both components, so I have to use it as a module in my HTML. But here I have the F1 quote with some styling and the IndyCar quote as well. What I now can do is add styling based on those variables. So for instance, let's say the F1 quote, I'm setting some primary, secondary, and tertiary colors, and now it's changed, right? That's cool. Here, I'm going to do something different in the IndyCar quotes. I want to have a default color. So what I'm doing is I'm introducing a new variable that I'm going to use in my HTML, but it isn't defined here in my component. So I'm setting the IndyCar primary color, and you will see the secondary color and tertiary color, but have a fallback to the variables I already had there in colors. Yes, and I type slow, I know, and make mistakes even while I'm recording. But this is the last one. Set it to another variable. and then it's back to the default because we haven't set anything in the HTML yet. So let's go to the HTML and say, well, let's set some variables on the root there. And there you have it. It's changed. But I'm not really happy with the F1 quote, for instance, because maybe you have multiple F1 quotes as well. So let's give it a class of max and add it there as well. And then you have a little bit more control over what you're styling. But still, I think it's not the best way to do it. You can do it, but I would think there's a better way. And the better way is to give the user of the component, you as a developer, way more control over the styling. And we can do that with the part pseudo-element. And it's easy to implement, and it's so powerful. So if I go to my component again, I'm going to say, well, this paragraph is now a part called quote. Nothing happens yet until I'm going to write some CSS here. And I'm going to say, well, of the F1 quote, the part that's named quote, I'm now going to apply a bunch of CSS myself. And now it completely overrides what's styled from within the component, but you can do all the things you want with it. So I think this is really, really powerful, and probably the best way to support styling as well. All great, we have a static paragraph in a component, but that's not what we want, right? You want to be able to pass data or set strings and stuff like that. So we can use properties. And to be able to use properties, you have to have a getter and a setter in your component. And essentially what you're saying is you're using an internal variable. I'm calling this underscore quote. And that will take care of setting the inner HTML that's mentioned above in the template. You get it, a setter, a getter, and I'm getting the template paragraph there. It's empty now, there's nothing in it, so it will be blank if you use it without providing any properties. You can see it here, it's empty. But what I can do now here is just query selected, call it a component. I can target, I call it driver quote now, not F1 quote anymore, but driver quote. And now I have access to it, and I just can say component dot quote, because that's our property, and I'm pasting again Max's comment from 2017. Great. We have access through JavaScript, but maybe you don't need that. Maybe it's too much. So we can use attributes, just like you can use attributes on normal elements. So if you look here, I have an attribute called quote. And this will pass the quote to the component. What we do need to do here is we still need a getter and a setter, but we need something extra. We need to make sure, and that's essentially the last part of it, that we are listening to an event that's called attribute change callback. So every time an attribute is changed, removed, or added, this will be triggered. And we're getting the attribute name, we're getting the old value, and the new value. And what I did here is I'm listening if it's the quote, and if it's the quote, I will put that as the new value. But you need something extra, and that's on top. You need to have a static method called observed attributes to give an array to the browser saying, well, listen to these attributes, because an element can have multiple, multiple attributes, but you don't want to listen to all of them, because it will take a lot of power and it will slow things down. So I'm only listening to the code here. So a very simple example, you already saw it in code, it's like I'm adding code here, and now it's there. But I can still go to the JavaScript and override it by a property. Or change the attribute through CSS instead of in the HTML itself. So you have multiple ways to do that. But keep in mind that attributes can only be strings. If you want to pass an object or an array, then you have to use properties and fall back to JavaScript in this case. You might have seen that I called it quote. A good practice is to use data attributes if you're introducing your own attributes. So data dash, there should have been data dash quote. But to be honest, I have to find the first developer that does that consequently. I don't, but if you want to do it right, make sure you do it like this. OK, we have set some things now, and we already saw an event, but there are more. So let's look at the lifecycle events that we have. You saw this one, the attribute change callback. So it's every time you, as I said, every time you add, remove, or change an attribute, it's called, and it's in combination with this one, an array of attributes that needs to be observed by the browser. But we also have connected callback, and that's something like created in Vue, for instance. Every time it's added to the DOM, this one is called. And the opposite, when it's removed from the DOM, we have the disconnected callback. And we have a weird one that's called adopted callback, and that is invoked every time a custom element is moved to a new document. I've never seen a use case for it, but I have an example how that works. So let's see here. I have a little example component that I can add and remove a component, and I can adopt a component. And you will see if I run the video that I also have the attribute changed callback in there, in the HTML itself. So let's refresh this. And you can see the attribute change callback is being called with the attribute name of value. Old value is null, the new value is hello world. Well, let's click on add remove. Now you can see that it was disconnected, and the connected was add load. It's connected again if I click it, and now the weird thing, I have an example component in an iframe, and I just get it to my own document. It feels like magic, but that's the adopted callback. So there are not a lot of events to remember, but they are very powerful. OK, attributes, properties. What about slots like you have, for instance, in Vue? I'm mentioning Vue a lot because I'm working in Vue. So that's my reference. For instance, if we have this with the attribute quote, wouldn't it be easier just to do this? Right, just pass it inside of the element. And in my template, in my component, I need to add a slot there. So this is the default slot. It's picked up and placed there. You can imagine how that looks, but just for demo's sake, I paste it here and it's there. But more importantly, we also have named slots, because if you want to have more slots to use, more kinds of text you want to add or something, it's easier to have name slot because you only have one default slot. So in this case, for instance, I have a slot called driver because of the layout. I want to have it in a different place. And inside the default slot, I have the text because I know I'm going to place it there. But I also added an attribute here called image to put it in my component. And this is how the template looks inside of my component. I have a div that's called card with an image, then an h2 with the name of the driver in this case. And you can see I target this slot with name is, so that reference to slot is in the HTML. And then in the paragraph, it's the default slot again. I have to add this, of course, a getter and a setter for the image now, because that's an attribute. But that's the same way we did earlier with the quote. And this is how it looks. And I can mess around with it. I can change this slot to his father and saying, whoa, there's a giant lizard there. So this is the use of slots. I would recommend to use name slot because then you have more control on where things go. But you're free to use anything. All right, we have stuff in there, but what if we want to get stuff out of there? If we do a click on a button or something? Well, we can easily dispatch events as well. And this is the way to do it. We dispatch an event. We create, in this case, a new custom event. We give it an event name, maybe button click or whatever. And in the options, we have detail with the data we want to provide to the parent component that's calling it. You can also use just new event if you don't need to send details, but most of the time, you need to send something back to the caller. And in the caller, in the parent, we can say, well, we add an event listener to that event name, and we get the event back, and we can say, well, in this case, e.detail, whatever it is that we're sending back. Of course, there's a demo for that as well. And to make it a little bit more interesting, I thought, well, let's add a map, for instance. So this is my example component. I'm calling a web service that provides me with all the circuits Max Verstappen has driven on in his career. And I want to make sure if you click the button, it will dispatch my click. And that dispatch says, well, just get a random circuit and send that back to the web component click event. So the caller can use it on his page. And this is the JavaScript that's using by the HTML page. A lot of boilerplate for setting up the map, but the most important thing is it has an event listener to the web component click. I log the data I'm getting. I'm getting an object, and that object I'm using to set the coordinates for the map and some extra information. So let's see how that works. I click the button, and there I get an object back saying, well, this is Bahrain with some information about the latitude and longitude and the country and stuff like that. And I can put it on the screen like that. If I dispatch it again, just give me a random one. We're going to Qatar. I dispatch it again, and we're going to my favorite one in the Netherlands, Zandvoort, with all the data as well. Great. We have events. What about events between components? That would be even nicer, right? So let's look at an example like a list detail one. So I'm compiling a driver list with all the drivers of 2021. I will explain later why 221. And if you select a driver, we pass the data to a detail page. So I've defined two custom elements here, drive list and drive detail. I have some JavaScript that makes sure that if a driver is selected, it listens to the select driver event, and it's passed on to the detail component, so we can display it there. And lastly, I'm just fetching an API again to get the drivers. And the list, the object with all the drivers, the reply of that service, I'm giving to my list component, but I'm setting the first one to the detail already. The driver list is actually just a select, and the data I'm getting fed by the instantiation of it. I'm creating options and putting them in the list. That more isn't there. And when you select something, it will change, and that we will send back. We dispatch a new event called select driver, so the details can use it. This is the details. Also a getter and a setter because we're getting a driver. And I have a little template saying, well, this is how it should look. In this case, I'm just writing it directly in the shader root, don't have a separate template for it. It's fine if it's small. If it's getting bigger, you probably should use a template. All right, let's see how that looks. So the first one that's there is Fernando Alonso. So let's select another one. For instance, let's select Sergio Perez, number 11. The next one, Tsunoda, 22. You see where this is going? Max, 33. Well, it's 1 now, but it used to be 33. Lewis, 44. I love this. Science, 55. Anybody know 66? No, it's not there. So 77, Valtteri. 88, we have Robert Kubica. And we have 99 as well last year. That was Antonio Giovinazzi. I love this. Numbers going up and up. One fair warning, though. If you've worked with JavaScript, you know that it might fail sometimes. And you get very angry about it and kicking your laptop, or in this case, your blown tire. So it might be useful to make sure that the user sees something when your JavaScript is failing, because if your web component fails, this is what the user will see. That's not really useful, right? And it could be your problem. It could be because of a third-party JavaScript that's also running there. But make sure that the user knows something should be there. So I would say, for instance, let's add this to our slot. Well, not slot really, if you're not using the slot, but you know, if driver code is not recognized by the browser because of a JavaScript error, it will print this message. But if you're using slots, and this is your default slot, you have a problem. So good old no script, I would use for that. This is only triggered if JavaScript is, for instance, disabled. Okay. The last 10 minutes, I want to show you an implementation of my video component into frameworks like React, Angular, Vue, and Svelte. I never know how to pronounce it. Svelte, Svelte, I don't know, Svelte. So if you ever had to include some YouTube or Vimeo videos in a website, you go to YouTube, you select the embedded code to have it in your website, and you end up with crap like this. Even worse, if you are having a CMS and they want to include a video, they have to do this. And 9 out of 10 times, they mess it up. The last one is the HTML video tag itself. It's easier, but it's still error-prone. So, wouldn't it be easier to do something like this? Just have a video component, and you add YouTube or Vimeo or HTML5 to it, and it can be shown. That's what I did. So I created this video component element, and just lazily just copied the data from Vimeo and YouTube, but made sure that it will listen to the attributes YouTube, Vimeo, and HTML5, and then replacing it in the setters and the getters. Here you can see attribute change callback like we saw before. We're listening to this, and if we get one of those, we set it. It's very basic and plain and simple component, but it will serve its purpose. And it will look like this. So the top one is YouTube, the second one is Vimeo, and the last one is the HTML5 video tag. Keep in mind, if you're using the HTML5 video tag, you need to either include the video on your own website, or it should be an URL. It can't be a YouTube video, for instance. So I published this on NPM, and now I can use it like this in my browser. Without frameworks yet, I'm using unpackaged, and I'm referring to this component. And then it works the same like we did before. But let's look at some frameworks. Angular. What do I need to do in Angular to get this working? Well, of course, it needs to be one of the 1 million dependencies of your project. So I'm installing my video component here in the package JSON. And in this case, I'm going to use HTML5 video, so I'm adding this video to my assets in my project itself. Next up, I'm going to my app module. I'm going to import that new component. And I also need to set the schema to accept custom elements. If I don't do that, Angular will say, well, I don't know what you want to do, but I'm stopping here. And lastly, in my app component HTML file, I include it somewhere I want to, and it will look like this. It's part of it, and it's fully functional. Vue. For Vue, same, less dependencies. I created these projects. They're also available on GitHub, by the way, just plain boilerplate projects. So I'm adding here the Vue component as well, video component as well. In the main.js, I import it, and then in the app.vue template, I can use it. And there it is. React. React is a little bit more difficult. Of course, I add it again, and I can add it to the app.js. That's it. But one thing to keep in mind of React is I'm just showing a video now. But if you're doing extra stuff like dispatching events, React doesn't really work that well with Shadow DOM yet. So you might need to write a little wrapper around this component. This is how it looks in React. Lastly, Svelte. It's adding the component again, of course, and then importing it and putting it in HTML, plain and simple. And here it is. And now I'm hoping the sound is working on my laptop. And let's see.
There's a giant lizard on the truck. Yeah, I'm not joking. Out of turn 3.
Face to face with Godzilla then, mate.
Yeah, we are on the lookout for, you know, ducks and cats on the road, but yeah, lizards, that's another thing, right? One thing, I'm not going into deep to this, but there are 2 frameworks, Lit and Stencil, that can make your life a little bit easier making web components. Keep in mind that Lit will ship some extra code to make your web components work, and Stencil is more lightweighted and just gives you the tools to create web components. If you're interested, have a look. They have great documentation as well. And with that, I want to say Dankeschön. The slides, the links to GitHub with all the demos and all the projects is on this shortcode, WADWC. And I think we have some time left for questions, so if you have any, let's do it.
Thank you. Thank you, Rowdy, for the presentation. So there are a lot of questions that have been posed.
Okay.
And one of the most rated one is, how can FT quote work with accessibility, especially when JS is disabled?
Well, when JavaScript is disabled, you don't see the element as anyway. So that's a problem, definitely. So I wouldn't, just like using frameworks, I would be sensible about it. Only use it where it gives you some extra stuff. Always use plain HTML and CSS if you're doing the normal stuff. But sometimes, yeah, you need to have something extra.
What are the benefits of using web components over React or JS framework, JavaScript framework?
I forgot to mention that. Good question. I work at a large insurance company in the Netherlands. We're serving about 5 million customers, and we have many departments. We are writing our components in Vue. Other ones like, hey, React, and other ones might say, well, we want Angular. With using web components, you only have to write it once. And not everybody is going to recreate that button again. So it's using it in every framework you want. That's the benefit.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of vanilla JavaScript. Like, I would say, whatever you can do with just pure JavaScript, do it.
Definitely. Yeah.
And do all the major browser engines already support the pseudo-part class selector thoroughly, so you can rely on it over using CSS variables?
I have to lie a little bit, but I think they do. But I have to. I will check, and I will post it on my Twitter.
What about web components and accessibility? How screen readers can handle it?
As long as you give them inside the proper HTML elements, then it's no problem. It's just a layer on top of it.
Can I use multi-line templates with template strings?
Yep.
Template string? How do you decide which components to create in your framework and which as web components? Perhaps dump components can be web components and smart components can maintain in your framework?
Well, they're giving the answer themselves. Yes, the dumb things like buttons, breadcrumbs, I don't know what else we're building, that could be web components because they look the same, act the same. But if you're doing something more smart, then you should probably go to the framework you're using.
Why using web components? Isn't using a FE framework just easier and does the same job? We're getting provocative here.
I have to admit, we started with web components and then we got pushback. So we're building view components now again. Sure, it can be easier, but if you want to save time and money across the company, or maybe next year saying, well, there's this new great JavaScript framework we want to use then, do you really want to rewrite all those silly components again, like buttons and input fields? I don't think so.
Okay, I will say that the other question can be answered like personally. That people
Sure.
can reach out to you.
I'm around.
But a big round of applause and thank you
Thank you.
to Rowdy for his thoughts.